Today we're going to talk about properties. The first one we're going to start with is commutative property. One thing when you're taking notes, it's a good idea to use Cornell notes, which is basically 2-column notes. So all I'm going to do here is divide my paper, if you're taking notes at home, which you should be. I'm going to divide my paper into almost in half. The left side will be a little bit smaller than the right-hand side. The left side is going to be for my main ideas. The right-hand side is going to be for my description of what we're talking about. So commutative property, what you should think of is this CO part in commutative. You have CO right here. Because what we're talking about with commutative is changing the order. So this is changing the order of your numbers. For example, I could have 6 plus 10. If I were to change the order, I would then have 10 plus 6. And we obviously know that 6 plus 10 is also equal to 10 plus 6, because both sides would equal 16. We also can do 7 times 9, which if I flipped it around or changed the order, I get 9 times 7. So again, this side would equal 54, or 63, excuse me, and this side would also equal 63. Keep in mind that we have 2 commutative properties. This property here is addition, and this property here is multiplication. So again, we have commutative property of addition, and we have commutative property of multiplication. There is no commutative property for division or for subtraction. So again, those properties are not commutative properties. Our next property we have is associative property. Again, I'm going to kind of draw my line here. You can also fold your paper. You might just be continuing on the bottom of your paper underneath of commutative property. One way to think of associative property is these 2 S's right here. This is, if you think of it as being a slip slide. Because what's happening is the parentheses are sliding. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. If I had 2 plus 3 plus 4, I could group the 2 and the 3 together. There's my parentheses grouping that together. I could also rewrite this. Again, 2.
Ramir Battle and Ania Battle to the office, please. Ania Battle to the office. Ramir Battle to the office. Thank you.
Again, 2 plus 3 plus 4. Instead of grouping it around 2 and 3, I can slide my parentheses to be around 3 and 4. So all that changed here is my grouping. So my grouping is going to change places. Again, I could do the same thing with 2 times 3 times 4. Here, I'm going to have 3 and 4 grouped together. And if I go to the other side, I'm still going to have the same order. That's important. The order has not changed. It's still 2 times 3 times 4, only this time I'm grouping my 2 and 3 together first. That's what's going to be changed here. So again, one thing we can think of it as the parentheses are going to slide. They just slid into a different position. Another way I like to think of it is to think of who are you associated with. For example, if we were sitting in groups of 3, maybe in this case 2 times 3 times 4, maybe 2 and 3 are going to work together in that group today, and 4 is going to be all alone that day. The next day, I'm going to have the same group of 2 and 3 and 4, only now 3 and 4 are going to get to work together, and 2 will be alone. So one way I like to think of it is, again, who are you associated with? You can also think of that as your friends. Sometimes you have more than one friend, and one day you're hanging out with friend A, and the next day you're hanging out with friend B. Okay, next property we have is pretty simple. This one is called identity. So the identity property, you're going to get the identical answer that you started with, which would make sense, right? Identity, it's going to keep its identity. Nothing's going to change about the answer. So you're going to get the identical answer. So for example, if I have 9 plus 0, when I add 0 to a number, it retains its identity. So my answer is 9. If I had 15 times 1, anytime I multiply a number by 1, it's staying the same number. So that's going to be 15. So the only thing to keep in mind here is we're either going to be adding 0 or we're going to be multiplying by 1. So again, we have an additive identity and we have a multiplicative. And let me go back just a moment because I think I didn't say that here. Yes, with the slip and slide with the associative property, again, we have an associative property of addition, just like we did with commutative, and we have an associative property of multiplication. So just keep that in mind. They have dual properties here. Again, there's no associative property. There's no associative for division or subtraction. Okay, our next property is our inverse property. And basically, if you think of inverse as an opposite, this is kind of a way to think of it. So what we're going to do, for example, now with inverse properties, there's two things. We have an additive inverse, first of all. And these are slightly different. We have additive and multiplicative again, but these are slightly different, different from each other. So the additive inverse, our answer will become 0. This is especially helpful when we're solving equations. For example, if I take 6 and I add to it the opposite of 6, which is negative 6, I get an answer of 0. That's where we want the number to cancel out, for example, when we're doing solving equations. We also have the multiplicative. Now this is a little bit different because instead of the answer being 0, we want the answer to become 1. So again, you got to be careful with this. Multiplicative, my answer becomes 1. Additive, my answer becomes 0. And what we're looking at here is something like this. If I have 3 over 4, and I multiply it by the reciprocal, which is 4 over 3, again, this is reciprocal, the reciprocal is a little bit like the opposite because it's the flip, for example, of the fraction 3 over 4. When I multiply this out, I wind up with 1 because we have the 3's here, 3 and 3, they cancel out to become 1. The 4 and 4 cancel out to become 1. Or I could just say 3 times 4 is 12, and on the bottom, 4 times 3 is 12, and so then 12 over 12 is equal to 1. Again, key thing to remember, additive inverse becomes 0 for my answer. Multiplicative inverse becomes 1 for my answer. This next one is really simple. You've known it since probably elementary school, even maybe kindergarten. It's the zero property. And what we know about this property is anything at all, anything. Anything times 0 is going to equal 0. Doesn't matter what it is. If I have 6 times 0, I get 0. If I have y times 0, I get 0. If I have 3x squared plus 2, oh, not plus, excuse me, 3x squared 2y times 0, if I have all that times 0, it's going to equal 0. Doesn't matter what I have, it's going to equal 0. This last property, I think, becomes a little more difficult for folks because this is a fairly new one. It's something we're going to be using a lot as we solve equations. This is distributive. So the distributive property, the key thing with this is literally to think of the word distribute. If I'm distributing something, I'm giving it to everyone. If I'm distributing papers in the classroom, for example. So I'm going to have 4 on the outside of this in here on the inside. So if I have 4 times 6 plus 2 inside parentheses here, if I was using order of operations, I could just add 6 plus 2 and then multiply it by 4. But sometimes it's going to get a little more complicated where I will not be able to add what's inside the parentheses because I have a variable in a number. So what we need to do is distribute. So I'm going to distribute, which means give. I'm going to give the number outside the parentheses to all the numbers inside. So again, I have 4 and then 6 plus 2. Remember when the 4 right next to the parentheses here, it means to multiply. So I'm going to take this 4 and I'm going to give it to the 6. So 4 times 6 is 24. And I'm also going to take the 4 and I'm going to give it to the next number in there, which is a 2. Keep in mind that it's a positive 2. That's going to come in handy later on. So 4 times positive 2 is positive 8. And then, of course, I could solve from there. But I've distributed the 4 to both numbers on the inside. Another way to show this, again, if I have 4 parentheses 6 plus 2, is I can show it where I haven't actually done the multiplication. I can just distribute. 4 to the 6 becomes 4 parentheses 6. Again, I'm adding here, so I'm going to add the 4 and the 2. So the 4 times 2. It's just another way to write it. Again, these are our properties. I'm sorry for all the interruptions. We kept having all calls. I hope you have a great night.